This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. I am Dave Thompson, your host. I have with me a good friend and colleague and an expert in this area, Mike Reddington. And before I give a little bit about Mike, I think Mike really embodies kind of the true spirit of what we're accomplishing or trying to accomplish with this podcast is how do we take effective communication skills and generalize them across so many different disciplines. Mike Reddington is the author of the Discipline Listening Method. We're going to go through his book today. The president of Inclusive, which we'll kind of explore what that is and what that means. Certified forensic interviewer. Pretty much all around a good guy, other than being a Patriots fan. He's a renowned keynote speaker, an expert in the field of not just interview and interrogation, but really just effective communication techniques. So I'm excited about our conversation today. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. It's always great to see you. I'm so excited that you're doing the podcast and thrilled to be able to join you for an episode. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike and I have had several years of opportunities to kind of collaborate and work together and kind of exchange some ideas. And what I like to start with, because nobody knows your background better than you, and it's neat because it's diverse in what your path has been. But I think there's been kind of a consistent theme to all the different places that you've been and what you've been working on. So maybe you can share a little bit about where you've been and where you are.
I appreciate you asking. And I feel like, too, as we got to know each other, the diverse background and sort of unintentional paths that led us here were some of the similarities that we initially bonded over and started sharing ideas and backgrounds on. So very long story short, I started off as a special education teacher and baseball coach and thought that would be all I would ever do until my friends peer pressured me into trying the financial industry, where I lasted 2 years, 1 month, and 2 days, which is exactly 2 years, 1 month, and 1 day longer than I ever should have been there to begin with. But after that, I was juggling part-time jobs as I went back to school to get a business degree. And a friend of mine one day, when I just said, "Hey, I need another job," he said, "Well, why don't you come catch shoplifters with me?" And honestly, at that point, I had no idea that there was a specific group of people whose job it was to catch shoplifters. I didn't know loss prevention was a thing. I thought if you stole something and an employee saw you, they just grabbed you. I didn't know. So I ended up in loss prevention at the time for Sears by accident. And they ended up promoting both my friend Mark and I to management. And as everyone listening with a loss prevention track knows, once we got to that level, a big part of our focus became identifying employees who made regrettable decisions and then encouraging them to tell us all about it and write it down in detail and then go work somewhere else after. So I was lucky to be in a spot where, to be completely honest, actually several spots in a row, where I happened to replace somebody that hadn't done a great job with their internal operations and controls and investigations. So there was lots of work for me to do. And thankfully, I was able to earn a reputation for myself and had attended some WZ programs and had stayed in touch with those guys. And after earning my CFI designation, they asked me to move out to Chicago and work for them. So spent 10 years with WZ, which is where I met you. And we had the opportunity to work together for several years. And then while I was with WZ, I started spending more and more time working with CEOs and executives, applying the same techniques to their conversations. And it dawned on me that we are solving the same exact communication problems in our investigative interviews that they're solving in their negotiations, business development conversations, leadership conversations, and so forth. So I just became captivated by the opportunity to teach these people who had been so successful for so long how to see conversations differently and how to consistently get results out of their conversations that before seemed at best improbable. So I always have to give thanks to Shane and the whole team over there at WZ, who have been so supportive of everything I've done with and since, but it got to the point where it made sense for me to step out and really just focus this on my own. And so that's when I started Inclusive and wrote the Discipline Listening Method. And now I spend the majority of my time doing just that, teaching leaders at all levels of organizations how to encourage people to share sensitive information under vulnerable circumstances in the face of consequences. Because as leaders with any title, that's what we do every day, all day.
Yeah, that's it's a neat career path. Maybe we can explore some of that too. But there's a common denominator of, I guess, teaching and mentoring and inspiring, whether it's baseball and you're, I'm sure, yelling at people because they're in the wrong. But I mean, I don't know if you were probably t-ball, but I can see you still yelling at Johnny playing first base and standing in the wrong spot.
No, actually, I do really enjoy teaching, and I think that's one of the things that we have in common. And maybe because my brain has never evolved much past a 6 year old, I feel like I understand that level really well. So yeah, coaching 5 and 6 year olds baseball and jujitsu, it's really about helping build the confidence and the enjoyment in the game itself and teaching them some of the fundamentals. So there's actually a story I've been telling since the fall season in a lot of the leadership programs I do, where it was a rough weeknight practice with a team of 6 year olds, like tired after a school day, not a whole lot of listening, a little bit more goofing off. And I decided just to call the practice like 15 minutes early. Like there's no point in dragging this out to the end. So I'm standing on the first baseline with my buddy who I'm coaching with. And I'm like, all right, bring it in. And what I meant was everybody come to me. But
Right.
all the kids ran right past me into the dugout. And my buddy Ron looks at me and he's like, well, they're not listening tonight. I'm like, no, dude, that's my fault. And he looks at me and I was like, lowest common denominator, dude. If you ask 10 people to do something and all 10 of them do the same thing, which is not what you thought you asked, like, the problem isn't them. The problem is me. We're going to have this last conversation in the dugout, and just kind of turned
Yeah.
around and went. So I think it's all about, and it's true in leadership. And honestly, it's true in interview and interrogation. What we get out of people is often driven by how we make them feel. And that is true on a Little League baseball field, it's true in an interrogation room, and it's true in a boardroom.
Yeah, that's great, and I think that's a good example of self awareness that most people don't have. I know you talk a lot about that in your book. It kind of looking at ourselves and learning how could I have done that better? What was the message I was trying to convey versus what somebody received? You've got a statement. I like this, and I would support this comment about you. But Mike is an expert at moving people from resistance to commitment. And I think it's kind of, maybe you can expand on that, but that could be the same thing of getting, I've got a nephew who's 5 years old. And so I can understand getting him to eat vegetables versus not, getting him to turn off his iPad and focus on something. But that could be the same as talking to a CEO, talking to their team and get them to bought into a new strategy. So I guess, how do you expand on that kind of transition, resistance to commitment? What does that mean?
You nailed it. And it is the same across the board. I like to joke. People will ask me, Mike, where did you learn how to handle a room full of CEOs? Coaching T-ball. Like, believe it or not, the similarities of trying to keep a group of CEOs engaged and a group of 6 year olds engaged is astonishingly similar. But when we think about it, I feel like, honestly, and I don't know that you and I have talked about it in these words before, but I feel like one of the biggest benefits of the career that I don't know, we had chosen for us, ended up in, however we want to phrase it, is that we were required to talk to people who wanted nothing to do with talking to us. And it wasn't just the suspects. A lot of times it was the victims. A lot of times it was the witnesses. And quite honestly, man, you know this. A lot of times it's the companies that hired us to do the investigations because they didn't want to tell us how bad they jacked it up before they called us. So
Right.
when we're constantly talking to people who want nothing to do with us, every action, every word choice, every facial expression, the distance we keep, all of these things matter. And you start learning both like academically with what we've studied, but also practically with the conversations that we had, what it takes to get somebody to move themselves from saying, I'm not going to do this, to I'm committed to doing this. And that separation of commitment and compliance is really important because I feel like a lot of times in both investigations and in business, when we hear somebody say, fine, I'll do it, we can put that in the win column. And that's not a win. Like
Right.
that's it might be like a temporary relief. Okay, I just conquered this resistance, but I'm going to get minimum effort for minimum time until nobody's watching. And then I'm going to not only go revert to my previous behavior, but I'm going to be resentful about what brought me to that previous fine. I'll do it. So putting like legal compliance aside, when we talk about compliance in conversations, well, sometimes that might be the only avenue we can arrive at. If we strive for commitment and we're really working to align somebody's self image with the decision we're asking them, now they're more likely to see it through. And you've seen this countless times in your career when people shake your hand at the end of an interrogation, or when you call the business owner or the HR person in after and they read the statement and they look at the person you just interviewed and they're like, yeah, actually, and I forgot to write this down. And they're continuing to admit even after the conversation because they had a choice. And when we walked them through the conversation in a way where they were a true partner, they made the decision at the end. And because they aligned their self image up with it, they stay committed to it after the fact. And that makes an enormous difference across the spectrum of relational communications.
That's great to discuss. I think explore further because when you and you know this, as soon as you said compliance, it triggers for me, of course, false confessions. And I'm not going to start on my soapbox on art because we'll be talking for hours about it. But when you think about people that are listening, might be able to apply this to talking to their kids, talking to their significant other, their family members, coworkers, or whatever. But when I think compliance is more of this emotional decision, right? You're almost forcing somebody because I need to agree with my boss or I'm going to get fired. I need to agree with my spouse or I'm going to have to deal with the problem later. I have to agree with my parents because I'm going to get disciplined. But when you do that, what's the loyalty and commitment to that decision afterwards? And I'm curious how you would translate this kind of in your space, but I know like in the investigative space, if somebody confesses to something true or false, right? If they give information because they're being compliant, that's going to impact maybe that law enforcement officer or the agency or whatever, their ability to get cooperation from that same person 3 months later because they're thinking, "Oh, screw this guy," right? They didn't treat me with respect and listen to me. But does that apply in the executive space? I mean, how do you see that with employee to employer?
It applies more so in the executive space. And you just nailed such an important point, especially for investigations. If I think about it from a law enforcement perspective, how many criminals participate in a pattern of criminal behavior? Like, we can get into the sociological reasons why on another day over another series of beverages, but a lot of criminals find themselves either re-engaging in similar criminal behavior, being in the vicinity of other crimes that have been committed, or knowing other people that have committed other crimes. So whether you're in New York City or whether you're in Lombard, it doesn't matter. The size of your town, you're going to run into people over and over and over again. And how you treat them now sets the stage for how they expect, how they prepare, and how they align their self-image for interacting with you later. So in investigative circles, it's extremely important. When we get to the business circles and family circles, now it's even more so because we're not talking about a criminal who I might convince myself I'm going to interview one time. They're hopefully going to tell me the truth. They're going to have their punishment, and then I might never see them again. As untrue as that often is, it's easy for an investigator to convince themselves of that. In business, we're going to see these people every day. And we're going to work on more projects with them, and we're going to hire new people that they're going to have to train and support. And with any luck, they're going to get promoted and they're going to end up in a managerial role where they're likely to repeat what they've seen other managers do within the organization. So it becomes more important. And a lot of times when we do these programs, like the what if questions, right? You've got a billion of these in your life. But well, what if it's this situation or that? Okay, there are absolutely times where somebody needs to be told, stop that now or do this now for safety reasons or emergency reasons or whatever it might be. But the opportunity now becomes at the very first chance, circling back and explaining with somebody exactly the goal that needed to be achieved, exactly why the behavior needed to be changed, why the conversation was had, so now we can move forward. So people, especially adults, don't feel like they were treated like a child. They feel like they were respected as an adult. And to flip it to the family conversations really quick, my son is here in my office with me today, so he may or may not be listening to this conversation at the moment. But even as my wife and I look at raising Gabriel, we understand that how we navigate difficult situations with him when he's young is going to set the standard for how we navigate difficult situations as he gets older. And those difficult situations get a lot more real. So we're setting the building blocks for how we navigate difficult situations as a loving, supporting family now. So that way the foundation is set when the stakes get much higher when he's older. So it translates across the board.
You touched on, I'm hearing I don't think you said the word, but I feel like it's a lot about credibility of the leader or the person managing that conversation. And I know one of the things that a lot of people might fall victim to is being deceptive or bluffing as the whether it's the interviewer, the manager, the whatever. And my comparison to that could be trying to get somebody bought into a project, and a leader hangs a carrot in front of their face of what might happen if they do this. It never comes true. Or in the investigative space, lying about evidence to try to convince somebody of their guilt, or making a false promise that, hey, if you cooperate, this will happen. And I think, again, for me at least, that goes back to, it might get you compliance right now, but it's not going to give you that long-term commitment. But what else do you think helps create, I guess, credibility and trust from us as the leader of the conversation?
Great question. And I'll double down on what you said about using the carrots and the bluffs. To me, anytime I see that happening, it tells me that somebody's going for the immediate compliance. They've got a tactical view, not a long term strategic view. And hopefully, I'm not offending anybody. They have a shallow toolbox.
Right.
If they had better tools, if they had better techniques, they wouldn't be doing these things. But to get back to your question about establishing trust, I'll start quoting some other people. But it really starts with what are the little things we do every single day. So if I'm a leader in an organization and I'm at a workforce where people are actually seeing themselves, they're seeing their teammates at work, you're going to the office, don't ever walk by somebody without saying hello, ever. Just don't do it. Because if you walk by somebody without saying hello, you're telling them, I don't care about you. And they only have to experience that once or twice before they now have no motivation to help us because they don't believe that we will help them. And when I was in loss prevention, I ended up at a location in New Jersey where the gentleman that I had replaced hadn't had a particular focus on workplace investigations. It turns out he had a particular focus on one employee that took a lot of his time when he was in that role. So I had the opportunity pretty quickly to provide several managers the opportunities to restaff their departments. And when I came in one day, the manager of the receiving dock stopped me. He's like, hey, man, they're calling you the axe murderer. And I was like, okay, that's a problem. Like, I'm just doing my job. It's not my fault that other people didn't do it prior. Like, so we got our team together, and the first thing we decided was no matter what, when you come in, you go say hello to every single person in this building before you start your day. And no matter what, before you leave, you go say hello to every single person in this building before you leave. And within a year, we led the organization in dishonest employee cases resolved and employee tips.
It's crazy. It seems for people listening, if they're not in that space, it seems so counterintuitive, because I think there's this like mysterious feel of the investigator is sitting in some closet, watching what's going on, and is kind of an enemy of the people. But what we've seen, obviously, is cooperation comes from being a human first and an investigator second. And the same with, I think, being a leader of a business, being a parent, being whatever it might be, is understanding whatever side of the fence of the conversation you're on. You're people working with people, and there's a lot of other emotions and variables at play. And that, it kind of takes me into another concept. I've got your books. So those that are watching, here's Mike's book. You can see my notes on the side. Those are the pages not to read. These are I highlighted some stuff that I thought was really interesting to expand on. I really like the way you wrote the book, Mike, because it comes across very much like a story. So it's easy to kind of feel and relate to these conversations regardless of your career field. But we just talked a little bit about like the credibility of the interviewer in whatever circumstance. But you talk a lot about active listening and empathy in here. And there was one of these quotes that I thought was really interesting. It reminded me of an example I heard on the radio. And then I'll give you, your quote is, react reflectively, not reflexively. And I'll give you one quick example that I want you to kind of expand on what this section is all about and what you mean by that. I was listening to the radio recently, and there was a story of a bride at her wedding, bride and groom, and she's cutting the wedding cake on the table, and the table just collapses in front of whatever, 200 people. And as that happens, there's options here. Is she could laugh, she could cry, and then obviously whatever she does is what 200 people are going to do. So if she starts to cry or get upset, or the groom starts to get upset and yells at the server, 200 people are awkwardly looking at their phones. And in this circumstance, she laughs. And when she laughs, 200 people laugh. And it's kind of how important our behavior is to others. And you talk about that same type of concept. We've talked about an example like that before. But I'll let you kind of expand on reflexive versus reflective and how difficult that actually is.
Yeah, that's a great example. And to shorten it, if you're okay, they're okay. And I think often as leaders, again, in any role, informal or formal, we often hopefully aspire to set a high bar. We want people to rise to our level. And more often than not, as long as they get close, we're good with that. But what we fail to often realize is that our best behavior is the bar people aspire to. But our worst behavior now becomes justification for them to behave even worse. So if I am not calm, if I'm anxious, if I'm inconsistent, if I'm a bully, if I'm all these things, then other people can justify doing it even more so because they saw me do it. So that concept of like, if you're okay, they're okay. Calm is contagious. All of these things are so important. When we talk about reacting reflexively as opposed to, reflecting as opposed to reflexing, I should probably be able to say my own words correctly. Really what we mean is stopping to think for even just a second before we take action. Because our first response to any situation is almost guaranteed to be based on our emotions, how we feel, and the emotion we either want to relieve or experience, which means it's going to be based on me, not you. And if I want to make any forward progress in any scenario, I need to give you the experience that you require in order to change your behavior. So almost guaranteed, the first words that are going to come out of my mouth are going to make me feel better. Yeah. And if they make me feel better, there's a reasonable likelihood it's going to make my audience feel worse to some degree. And my wife has a note on our refrigerator at home that I think applies beyond that specific context. But it says, you can't make a child behave better by making them feel worse.
That's good. I like that.
And so just taking a moment to think, wait a minute, what's the goal that I'm trying to achieve here? How does my next reaction or behavior help me achieve that goal? And then acting appropriately.
Yeah, I think we did a presentation a few years ago when you were just describing this, reminded me of the title of that, which was "Wit is not a strategy."
Yes.
And I think
that feels like a very Brett Ward thing to write.
Yeah, it does. But the difficult part is a lot of people, I'm sure, that are listening feel like they're quick on their toes and nimble in a conversation. They're ready with a comeback or a response all the time. And I think what you just said really nails that. The higher the emotion, probably the lower the quality of what you're going to say. And from a personal standpoint, I know sometimes you make that passive aggressive comment back and you feel like you won the conversation, but now you're going to hear about it for 6 months. And people are going to judge you by what that first emotion was. So you, in the book, to that point, you talk about, and in an article I was actually reading that you wrote, I think this one was with Forbes, but it was about minimizing distractions internally, like your internal dialogue. How do you do that? How do you remove that voice that's in your head when you're in such like an emotionally exhaustive conversation?
And I think you just nailed something that a lot of people don't take the time to think about. An investigative interview, an interrogation is emotionally exhausting, not just for the person who is being asked the questions, but the person facilitating that conversation. Leadership conversations are emotionally exhausting. When we think about the buildup and the preparation and the worry and the concern and all of the things that go into these conversations. So when we are trying to lead these conversations, it's important to understand if we really want to engage with somebody else. It's like when I used to teach interrogation and people would ask, how do I get better at reading behavior? Well, memorize what you're going to say. Well, that's not the question I'm asking. How do I get better at reading behavior? Well, memorize what you're going to say. You're not listening. No, you're not listening. The key to success in any conversation, especially an emotional conversation, is limiting the amount of variables we need to address at any one time. So the more variables I can have under control before I enter the conversation, the less I have to think, which means the more I can concentrate on what somebody else is seeing and doing and pick up on a lot of these nuances that other people often miss. So the first one is preparation. The more I'm prepared with what I want to say, the questions I want to ask, the illustrations I want to make, and honestly, the decisions I want to make. I don't want to be making decisions under stress if I can avoid it. So the more decisions I can make, the better prepared going into the conversation, the easier it is to limit that internal monologue. The second one, honestly, is kind of cheesy. We all phase out. I recently interviewed somebody who said that their research shows that even the people who pay the closest attention zone out roughly 25% of the time in a conversation. Makes me feel a little bit better about myself.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
So when I catch myself talking to myself, just realizing it and coming back as quickly as I can. And the third one, you might laugh at, and I would recommend, but often I think you know this. When our emotions start to change, we tend to register that physiologically before we do cognitively. Like our body changes due to the emotion before we realize it. So instead of just trying to figure out what somebody else's tells are, it's important that we learn what our own are. So for me, I learned a long time ago through an observer who I don't realize if she knew what she was telling me at the time. But when my emotions start to change, I start curling my toes in my shoes. So if you in a conversation and I feel my toes start to curl, I know I'm not listening to you. I know I'm talking to myself. I might not have realized it yet, but I can't be listening to you if I feel my toes curling because now I'm focusing on my emotions. I'm not focusing on you. So when I feel that, or the second one for me is I have chapstick in my pocket. I'll make like a fist around it and I'll squeeze it. If I feel those, I need to tell myself, I'm choosing the emotion. I need to listen to Dave. And so those are, for me, the three approaches that I use most often to really focus on limiting my internal monologue and engaging the person who's in front of me.
That's really important, and it's interesting perspective. I want to flip that on you, so that as a listener, zoning out maybe 20% of the time, which I can see. Like, even what's crazy for me is sometimes even speaking, and you do this all the time, but public speaking, you get 1,000 people in the room, and you're so prepared with what you're saying that sometimes I don't even know what the hell did I just say. Like, my head is somewhere else because I'm worried about the next thing I'm going to say or what the dinner plans are that night, and you're trying to be super engaged. But I think what about as the, I guess, host of the conversation, if I know that you're going to zone out 20%, 30%, 40% of the time, what can I do to try to keep you more engaged, to try to limit that percentage?
Great question. First, please don't talk to anybody like a child. Look at me when I'm talking to you, snap, point, all those things we typically want to try to stay away from, no matter how frustrated we might get. No adult likes being treated like a child. In fact, most children don't enjoy being treated like a child. So if I want to keep somebody engaged, a couple of things, and a lot of these I'm sure other people will say as well. How involved can I keep them in the conversation? Whether that is through questions, whether that is through asking them to lead the conversation, whether that's looking for their insights, ideas, whatever it might be. And that's from a preparation standpoint prior and during the conversation. When we're asking people questions, and this could be a whole nother hour conversation, asking them in a way that helps people save face. Because if we make them feel stupid with how we ask the question, they're not going to respond. So making sure we're helping people save face throughout the conversation. The second are things that I think are widely taught across disciplines. Can I vary my volume? Can I vary my tone of voice? Can I vary my position? So as I'm moving my chair, I don't want to aggressively move towards them, but as if I vary my position in my chair, that movement might be enough to captivate their attention. If they appear to be obviously drifting, like their eyes are glazed over, they're looking straight at the floor, their feet are pointing at the door, whatever it might be, maybe I'll pause. But when I pause, I'm breaking eye contact. When they look back towards me, they don't want to see me staring a hole in their head. That's only going to make them feel more uncomfortable. So if I'm going to pause, I'm going to look away. And out of my peripheral vision, when I see them re-engage, now I'll come back to meet their gaze. So it feels like they were the ones who were leading the re-engagement. And if I do feel like somebody didn't hear what I said and it's an important conversation, I'm going to give them an excuse to admit that they didn't hear it. Because if I just say to somebody, you were ignoring me, you didn't listen to me, you didn't catch that, did you? They're going to lie. They're going to say, yeah, I did. And then when I ask them the question and they don't have it, we're just cascading downhill here. So, I like to be self-effacing, maybe too much sometimes, but I can say something like, hey, I don't know how many times a day I start thinking about, wait a minute, what time is my son's practice? What time do I need to leave here to pick him up? How much of what I just said do I need to repeat?
Yeah.
And now it's on me, it's not on them, and it's easier for them to re-engage.
Yeah, that's good feedback. And the newest variable to that is virtual communication, right? A lot of these conversations are happening over Teams or Zoom or whatever. And I mean, I'm sure you see it too, but you're on a call with somebody and all of a sudden their eyes go down to the bottom right of the screen because their email just triggered or they got a Teams message or whatever. And it's so easy to see as the other person on the call that now you feel disrespected, disinterested, and you're going to lose the flavor of the conversation.
Well, to your point, we're choosing to feel that way.
Right.
So I feel like, and I would actually love to hear your thoughts on this. One of the life changing lessons that I learned from a career in interrogation was people are supposed to lie to me. Like they're not trying to hurt me. They're exercising what they believe to be their last available good decision. Now it's a bad decision, but they believe it's a good decision. And honestly, as long I don't want them to lie to me, but at least they're talking to me. And if they're
Right.
talking to me, that leaves alternatives available. So it's almost like accepting the operational environment as it is and then creating new paths to success within that environment. So if the operational environment is team calls, Zoom calls, Google calls, whatever it is these days, well, then I know that people are going to be moving their eyes when they're emails. I know that other people might be coming in and out of the view. I know that their dog might jump in or their son might come over or whatever it might be. I just have to accept that as, you know what? I don't know that they're disrespecting me. Maybe it's in their control. Maybe it's out of their control. By the way, we're all Pavlov's dog. If your computer dings when you get an email, every time your computer dings, you're going to look at that regardless of who else you're talking to because it's a learned behavior. So I feel like in those scenarios, it's important to focus on what we do have, not what we don't have, and make the best out of that to keep people engaged and control our emotions. Because I'd be willing to bet for the people that get upset when it happens to them, whether we realize it or not, we do it to other people too.
Yeah, the Pavlov's dog reminds me. I was just at the airport yesterday, and or 2 days ago, and I'm on the shuttle from the rental car place, and you hear the text message sound. Somebody had their phone on, which I don't even know if I know what my phone sounds like anymore. I think it's been on silent for a decade, but as soon as that sound goes off, I swear 30 people all look at their phones
Yeah.
because you're just programmed for that. Well, you just the part you got into that I want to spend a couple more minutes on is kind of understanding the position of the other person you're talking to, whether they're entering the conversation with an incentive to lie or to be resistant, or they're having a bad day or whatever it might be. In your book, you gave a quick example of how you might handle calling a customer service line for somebody or for a company or whatever. And I'll let you expand on it, but just the basic context was, understand that that person might not be dealing with pleasant people all day. And so
Yeah.
you as the caller anticipate that. So you want to kind of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And you can even do a couple of recency bias examples from my last trip to Nebraska last week. Um, I just operate under the assumption that everyone I interact with is going to have more motivation to withhold information or resist my idea than they will to share information or accept my idea. It's like natural human psychology. So instead of being offended by it or trying to overcome it, I want to work with it. So if I'm going to call customer service, and this happened last year. Last year, I was going to Florida to do 2 client sessions, 2 different locations, 2 hotels. And once their dates are set, their dates are set. So when I book the hotel, I do the pay up front, no refund, cheapest cost deal.
Right.
Well, my son got really sick the night before, and we ended up in the ER till 2 in the morning. And I was not going to travel the next day and leave my wife and son alone in the house after that. Thankfully, he was fine. It was just a long night, but I wasn't going to do it. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, we get home from the ER. I email the client and the speaker coordinator and like, hey, here's what happened. I apologize. I'm happy to still do it virtually, reschedule. I understand whatever decision you want to make. They decide to do it virtual. It all works out. But I now have to get refunds for my 2 hotel reservations that explicitly said they're non-refundable when you make them. So when I call, I have to have a couple of things in mind. Number one, customer service people don't exist to help us. They exist to do the minimum required that's within their policy to get us off the phone. Like I used to work in customer service. That's what they're incentivized to do. And in this particular case, they're incentivized to tell me we can't do that, sir. You should have known what the policy was. So when I call the hotels, both in the Tampa area, when I called the first one, the woman at the front desk answered. And when she says, who am I speaking with? I don't say, Mike Reddington, you need to fix this for me. I say, "Good morning, Sarah. How are you?" And number one, I'm violating her expectations because almost nobody has ever said that to her before when they answer the
Right.
phone. So I've completely reframed this conversation in the first seconds. I wait for her to say, and it's usually pretty awkward because I don't know how to handle it. I'm good. How are you? And at that point, I'm doing well, thank you. My name is Michael Reddington, and I am calling in looking for assistance on an issue that's likely my fault. Nobody says that right away.
Right.
So now, like, they're completely out of their normal process of how they would handle this. And with any luck, they're liking me more than they like the average caller. So when she says, "Okay, what happens?" And here's another big switch. I don't say, "Can you refund this?" Because I'm walking her right into a no. I take bullets out of her guns and I ask a question in a way that allows me to gather intelligence from her answer. So instead, I say, "I'm supposed to be staying at your facility tonight. And when I booked the reservation online, I booked the pay in advance option, knowing full well when I booked it that it said refunds will not be available. Unfortunately, last night I was at the ER with my son until 2 o'clock in the morning. Thankfully, he's fine. He's home with us today. However, because of that, I won't be making the trip. I would be grateful for you to please walk me through the process that is required to obtain a refund for my reservation." So I admit, first, I'm nicer than she expected me to be. Second, I tell her right up front that I know this isn't supposed to happen. Then I give her the reason and ask her for the process. So when she tells me, "Well, Mr. Reddington, normally we don't do that, but let me place you on hold." Now I know I'm on the right track. She
Right.
comes back. "Well, Mr. Reddington, I appreciate you calling. Normally, we don't do that for our customers, but this time we're willing to make an exception. Thank you very much." I call a second hotel, do the same thing. This dude came back and gave me like a 30-second speech about how he was doing me the biggest favor in my life. But whatever, he refunded it. I'll take the speech and save my money. Last week, I had to go to a different print shop to get my handouts before I hit the road. And when I walked in, there were two women working. One was helping a long line of customers that I was at the back of. The second was running around doing 100 other things. By the time it's my turn, the second one steps up to the register, looks at me, and just like this says, "Can I help you, sir?" I took a step backwards away from the register. For the people that aren't watching, I held my hands palm down about chest high and slightly pushed them towards the ground. And while I did that, I went, "Whew, you're making me tired." She does this. And once she gave me that huge exhale, now she's in a position to help me. So I just walked up and like, "Hey, I just need copies and I'm happy to wait. It's no big deal." She says, "I'm going to have to use the computer in the back." She asks me how many. She goes, she sets it up. She comes back, looks at the other woman, tells her what to charge me, and then stops and says, "Oh, and give him 10% off." I'd never been in this print shop before. So like I'm not getting the frequent customer discount. Then I get to Nebraska, I get to the bagel shop the next morning and the same thing. I happened to be their first customer as they were still getting set up. So I physically distance myself. I take a step back. I smile. "No problem. I'm not in a rush. Take your time." By the time I'm done making my order, I order 2 sandwiches. The woman looks at me. She says, "I'm only going to charge you for one. I appreciate you being so polite this early in the morning." How we communicate with people changes what they will do for us. And those little things make a huge difference.
Those are great examples. As you were talking, I was picturing we live a similar life at these airports. But I was just this last week, I was stuck, ironically, at Charlotte Airport near by you,
Oh,
and
glad
it
you
was a
called me.
well, it was a layover. I didn't expect to be stuck as long as I was, but um, we both have this probably same weird enjoyment of people watching, and so of course I was lucky enough to just be delayed and not be canceled. And there was, I felt like 100 people in line at a certain airline's customer service counter. I stood there. I had to watch, and so I'm hearing these people, which I'm sure they're emotional, obviously, but yelling at the customer service agent. "How dare you switch my gate? Why didn't you do this? I need to get to work tomorrow." But then you start to think, from what you just described, that person is dealing with that same high energy, like being put down every 5 minutes, and they have a script of what they can follow. What a breath of fresh air it would be, even if you're high of emotion, to come in and just breathe for a second and say, "Man, your day is probably just as worse as everybody else's out here. Sorry you're dealing with this. Let's work together to a common outcome." And that the last thing I'm just going to mention, and I want to see if you got kind of a closing takeaway for everybody. But I know on your website, inquasive.com, there's you've got a landing page with a whole bunch of media that you've been involved in. So whether it's articles, podcasts, I encourage people to look. The one article I keep referring to, it's got the 6 characteristics of great listeners. And the last thing you just mentioned was number 6, really, sufficient confidence to empathize with people who harbor opposing perspectives. And that's one example there as kind of what was their state of mind. And so you expand on it here and in the book, which I think is great. But I know we covered a lot, and we could probably talk for 12 hours on some of these topics. But any last parting words or one last truth for listeners on a takeaway to be a better communicator?
Um, I guess I'll give you a couple, and then you can edit them down to one. If you, I'm not intentionally breaking your rules. I'm indecisive, so
Hey, the
don't take it
more the
personally.
better. At least you're being
Uh,
transparent about the process.
um, so I think if we look at like universal truths of conversation, things that if we accept, the relationships we build and the outcomes that we achieve are literally transformative, like things that we didn't realize we could do. Number one is realize that anytime you need information and somebody else has it, you're not in control of that conversation. They are. I don't care what your title is. I don't care what your role is. They've got the info. We need it. They're in control of this conversation. So with that in mind, it's not about what do I need to say or do. It's about what do they need to experience. We're in the conversation creation business. Call it what you want. And in that, it's not about creating the perfect thing for me to say. It's about giving somebody else the experience they need to commit to the outcome that we require. And that's true in the interrogation room. It's true in the boardroom. It's true at the dinner table. In order to do that, patience prevails. Let the conversation come to you. How many interviews have you reviewed from clients that submit them, and you hear or you watch interviewers just rush right to the point and they sabotage the whole conversation? For the interviews that you still do and that I used to do, they were so jacked up before we got there that I needed somebody else to tell me what they needed to experience in order to confess. So if I just walked in and went for it, the odds of being successful were infantile. But if I was patient enough to learn, then I could create that experience for them. And then I would just leave it with this: go out of your way to help people save face and avoid feeling embarrassed in all contexts. And if you can follow those guidelines, just those kind of vague guidelines to start with, the results we can achieve in our relationships and conversations will be far greater than we previously imagined.
It's a great takeaway. Hopefully, I would imagine people can take that and start to implement that immediately. I think that's one of the struggles. People hear these great takeaways and feedback, think, oh, that makes sense, and then they don't do a damn thing about it. So my challenge to anybody listening is listen to what Mike said and try to prepare yourself for the next conversation and check yourself a little bit. Before we wrap up, Mike, what are some ways that people can learn more about you and your opportunities you have to work with their teams, and obviously your book?
I appreciate you asking. Thank you. For anyone who's listening to the conversation is thinking, you know what, there might be a great opportunity for some customized educational engagements for our leadership team, our business development team, HR team, whatever it might be. They can find more about the programs we design for our clients at inquasive.com, INQUASIVE.com. If you're looking for more of the content, a lot of that you can find at michaelreddington.com, the articles, the podcast interviews, things like that. When you've listened to Dave's podcast and you're like, this is such a great topic, but I've already listened to all of Dave's, and now I need something similar until Dave's next episode comes out, you can check out I See What You're Saying, the Discipline Listening podcast, where we talk about all things communication with a wide variety of guests. And Mr. Dave Thompson was our very first guest on that podcast. So thank you again for that. And if you're looking to find out more about the book, The Discipline Listening Method, it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if you head over to the disciplinelistening.com, you can learn more about the book specifically there. Really, the only social media I'm on is LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Michael Reddington, CFI. And hopefully at any number of events or places, we'll have the chance to see each other in person and have a conversation. I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. We'll include all those links in the show notes. So if you're looking for some more information, highly recommend the podcast and the book, obviously. And Mike's a great person to reach out to and just kind of bounce some ideas off of. So I encourage that. Thank you, sir, for being with me for a little while today and providing some intelligence, we'll call it, to the community. That was me showing some empathy to you, making sure you were listening to keywords. No, Thanks for the great takeaways and the community, and obviously just kind of mentoring and sounding board for a lot of these conversations, including the podcast. So I appreciate your help. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.